Okay, so Mrs. Nelder, we'll be interviewing you today for Spring Bay Camp. So can you please tell me, of course, you know it's going to be the 70th anniversary coming up in 2011. And so some of us are going around and just interviewing some of the precious saints from the past. Can you tell me approximately when your first encounter to go on Manitoulin Island?
Well, my family, my natural family on my husband's side were originally from the Manitoulin Island. But my first encounter with going to the Manitoulin Island would be in 1970. What was my first date that I gave her?
67, approximately 67 years ago?
67 years ago.
Right. And now, did you find out about camp, or did someone tell you, or did you go with other people?
Somebody invited, Elaine Moore and her family invited us over.
Right. And where was Elaine Moore from?
She was from Sudbury.
Mm-hmm. So when you first started going to the camp meetings, do you remember approximately how many people attended at that time, 67 years ago?
I would say about maybe on a Sunday, we about maybe close to 75 to
75. 80. And today, in 2010?
Today, now, God bless us, we have 80 young people. So I would say I'm not too sure the exact amount of people that come regularly every summer.
So maybe 500 to 600 people?
I would say so.
Yeah. So now, what were the meetings like when you first started going to the Spring Bay Camp meetings?
We sang all the old hymns.
All the old hymns?
And we sang and we sang and we sang.
Right.
And Brother Blair was in charge, and he would give us a little pep talk about our financial situation. And we had some wonderful speakers at that time.
Do you remember some of them?
I wish I knew his name. I was thinking of him today. He was from down in the States. And he was such a good speaker. He'd never been up to Canada, but a real move with the Lord.
Oh, really? So moving up the Lord in which way?
Well, people got saved and filled with the Spirit.
Filled with the Holy Spirit. It was that the movement of the Holy Spirit in those days, because I was just watching a documentation on CBC, and they were saying that people who are filled with the Spirit and speaking in tongues, it's a movement that's coming back, especially all over Canada, through the youth. Did you see the young, old, and the youth filled with the Spirit?
Yes. It's always been the same. The youth have always been, as they came up to Spring Bay, have been touched by the Lord.
Right. And so the movement of the Spirit, are you talking about the Holy Spirit within our heart, or the baptism of the tongues?
The movement of the Spirit, where people do get blessed, and then people are filled with the Holy Spirit.
Right. Can you share an experience that you had within your family or within friends that you got to see God move?
Well, my son, Gordy, he was filled with the Spirit there. And Jamie was filled with the Spirit in Spring Bay.
Mm-hmm.
And the man who is now the head, what's his? But anyway, he was the one that prayed with him, and he was filled with the Spirit.
Laurie Gibbons?
Yeah, Laurie Gibbons.
Yes, yes. I want it to come from you, so. So share a story from Spring Bay that, from your family's history's point of view, that will stand out from one generation to the next.
Well, I think of the night that Jamie was filled with the Spirit. He had been in university, and he came up, and he was a little cold in his experience. But of course, with my family, if they came to Spring Bay camp meeting, they came to church. And if the visitors came, they had to come to church. That was kind of a prerequisite. So he came that night, and he said he was thinking to himself, well, if anybody lays hands on me, I'm not going to be very happy. But anyway, he sat down, and Laurie Gibbons came and sat beside him. And Laurie said to him, Jamie, would you pray for me? And it must have been a word from the Lord, because Jamie said all these things he had made up in his mind he was not going to do.
Wow.
The Holy Spirit just melted that defiant spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And as Laurie prayed for him, he was filled with the Spirit.
Wow. Have you seen a lot of people give their heart to Jesus at Spring Bay Camp?
Well, right, I've seen a lot as time has gone on. But like now, don't forget, I am now 88. And I'm not up at the altar the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not really, I'm praying, but halfway up.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not too sure how many have given their heart.
Right. Is
to
there
the Lord.
anyone that is close to you that in your family has given their heart to Jesus that you can call?
At camp?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I can't, this of course is right off the top of my head, and I can't actually remember.
Right. So that means everybody was serving the Lord, which is a
Pretty
really
well,
good thing,
yes.
eh?
And every year, Spring Bay is just a must in all of our
Right.
calendars.
So you're looking at, what, 4 or 5 generations?
Yes.
Yes. Can you tell the story of Billy Moore and how he brought a young family to Spring Bay Camp?
Well, I don't know about Billy Moore and himself. I knew Billy from when he was born. His mother was my best friend. And as he grew up, he turned his back on the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
But we all prayed for Billy. And you couldn't see many results of your prayers, but you prayed anyway. And he'd come up to camp. And it was most unusual. Maybe it's good to share this. How he came to know the Lord. These two ladies came up to Sudbury because a grandchild of theirs had been through a fire and was burned. And they came up to Sudbury to be part of the funeral in the morning of this situation. And while they were there, David Curry was the pastor then. And you'd have to know David Curry and Eileen. Their house was always open. So when these two strangers came, first of all, they I don't know whose house they went to begin with, but they went to church on Sunday morning.
Mm-hmm.
And David spotted this group, and they asked them all home for dinner. And Bill was one of that group.
Wow.
So anyway, they all went to David Curry's. Now this wouldn't be unusual for Eileen at all. It wouldn't matter whether she was expecting them or not. She would make them welcome. So they all went to Eileen's for dinner. And they sat and they talked about the Lord. And David and
Billy
gave his heart to the Lord.
Wow.
And he was changed. I'll tell you, he was so on drugs that he had come up back to Sudbury, because that's where he had started, and he went up to that drug rehabilitation place at Elliott Lake. And when he got there, he took a taxi and went up to the rehab. But by the time he got there, he was laying on the floor of the taxi. That's how far gone he was. And so the taxi driver went in, and they said, well, we have no room for him. And the taxi driver says, well, what am I going to do with him?
Mm.
So they took him in. And he said, he told me about afterwards, he says, Ida, I realized I'd hit bottom. And he says, I went through every program, but he says, I was not saved.
Mm.
And then he said, I went, that Sunday morning, I went to church when this was over, and I went home, I went to the church service, and I went to David, the Currys, and I found the Lord.
Awesome.
And he's, now that was about 15 years ago, and he's been a changed man ever since.
And so he's been serving the Lord, going to Spring Bay, and
Oh yes, every year.
awesome. One of my final questions is, if you were to speak to the younger generations that that attends Spring Bay, and there's many families I know personally that you know, what would be one of the things, if the Lord should call you home tomorrow, that you would want to leave behind to this generation?
Keep your account short with the Lord. You know, it's so easy to sin a little and say, oh, this doesn't really matter. But it does matter. And live close to the Lord. Ask the, I'm 88, and many times I stop and say, Lord, forgive me for that thought I thought. Forgive me for what I said. Because, you know, it's so important to keep a short account before the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And train your children. I prayed with my children. I pray with my grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
And now I have a great-grandchild, and I pray with her. Because I don't think there's anything that bonds a family together when they, like when they pray.
Right, right. And those experiences at Spring Bay Camp certainly is relevant around the altar, isn't it?
Oh my, yes.
Do you remember those times around the altar with your family?
Oh, definitely. And I remember with my arm around my grandson's shoulder, praying with him just 2 or 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because there's something about it that you feel so free.
Right. Right. I noticed that you have a cottage at Spring Bay.
Yes.
And do you remember when you built the cottage?
I guess it was about 60 years ago.
Right, right. And you still have your chair out on the deck.
Yes.
What are you watching? I noticed that like several times I'll go by, whether I'm driving or going to go for a swim. What are you doing sitting out on that deck in that chair all the time?
Well, people come along and talk to me. Some people are troubled in their